The heavy steel blade of the feller buncher was inches from the ancient oak when the machine's engine suddenly screamed and died, choked by a thick, oily black sludge that shouldn't have been in the fuel line. Inside the cab, the operator's radio erupted with a sound that wasn't static, but 1,000 overlapping whispers speaking a language that hadn't been heard in the Tennessee Valley for centuries. High on the ridge, Henry Calloway watched the machine stall, his fingers digging into the bark of a nearby trunk. He didn't realize he was bleeding until he looked down and saw that his blood wasn't red anymore. It was as dark and viscous as the fluid strangling the corporate engines. A mile away, the town's sheriff found Henry's discarded ranger jacket near a circle of obsidian totems that seemed to pulse with a slow, subterranean heartbeat. The fabric was torn, but there was no body, only a trail of heavy, dragging footprints that looked less like a man's stride and more like the furrow of a rooting tree. As the sun dipped below the mountains, the temperature in Blackwood Creek plummeted, and the residents noticed a strange, bark-like texture creeping across their own front doors. Something had woken up in the Relictovi forest, and it was no longer interested in peaceful protests. It was looking for a host to carry its ancient, suffocating grudge. Henry Calloway stood atop the jagged, wind-scoured ridge, his fingers digging deep into the gnarled bark of an ancient pine. Below, snaking along the narrow ribbon of asphalt that flanked Blackwood Creek, a procession of steel titans crawled toward the heart of the valley. These heavy haulers, bearing the bold, predatory logo of global logging, belched thick plumes of acrid, slate-colored smoke into the pristine mountain air. The rhythmic thrum of diesel engines surged upward, bouncing off the granite cliffs and drowning out the river's eternal, liquid murmur. Sunlight flared, blinding Henry as it caught the polished yellow cabs of bulldozers and the serrated, hungry teeth of feller bunchers. The gravel crunched under the weight of tires taller than a man, and the very ground beneath Henry's boots shuddered, a subtle, rhythmic trembling that felt like the earth itself anticipating the coming slaughter of its oldest giants. Walking back toward his porch, Henry felt the grit of the mountain air in his teeth. His fingers brushed the cold, pitted metal of his mailbox, where rust spots bloomed like dried blood. Inside sat a single envelope of heavy, cream-colored bond, embossed with the sharp, corporate geometry of the global logging insignia. Henry ripped it open, the dry snap of the paper echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of his empty yard. His eyes darted across the lines, snagging on clinical phrases like immediate harvest and sanitary clearance of the relict zone. The muscles in his jaw hardened into stone. With a sudden, violent motion, he crushed the official notification into a shapeless wad. The sharp edges of the paper bit into his palm, leaving white, indented tracks, before he hurled the crumpled death warrant into the dust at his feet, watching it settle among the pine needles. The air inside the Old Bridge Tavern hung thick with the smell of soured beer and the stale, clinging ghost of cheap tobacco. Henry loomed over a corner table where a sleek representative of the corporation sat, his button-down shirt crisp enough to cut glass. Henry slammed his palm onto the sticky surface of the bar, the force of the blow making the glassware jump and rattle. His voice vibrated with a low, dangerous frequency as he spoke of his great-grandfather, the man who had patrolled these borders when the town was nothing but a dream, and of the blood oath that bound the Calloway name to every trunk in Blackwood. The corporate man merely offered a thin, crooked smirk, adjusting a silver cufflink with practiced indifference. Henry watched that smirk, his knuckles whitening until they looked like polished bone, the urge to strike shimmering behind his eyes. Back in the dim sanctuary of his living room, the heavy oak lid of his father's trunk gave way with a long, agonizing moan of ungreased hinges. Henry inhaled the scent of mothballs, dried needles, and aged leather. From the cedar-lined depths, he pulled a charcoal-gray ranger's jacket, the fabric stiff with age and bearing a faded chevron on the shoulder. The coarse wool chilled his skin as he traced the tarnished brass buttons. Next came a yellowed, brittle roll of land surveys. Henry spread the map across the floor, pinning the curling edges down with his heavy work boots. The pencil marks his father had scratched onto the Blackwood Creek schematic felt like a secret code, a legacy of stewardship that now demanded a final, desperate translation before the forest was reduced to a scarred wasteland. The cold steel of the wire cutters clicked in Henry's grip, severing the tension of the high-tensile barbed wire. Twilight draped the woods in a gray, suffocating haze, through which Henry moved with the predatory silence of a shadow. A jagged barb caught the sleeve of his jacket, the sound of tearing fabric sharp in the stillness. But he didn't even flinch. Ahead, beyond the illegal perimeter established by global logging, the harsh glare of industrial floodlights sliced through the encroaching fog. Henry pressed his chest to the damp earth, inhaling the scent of rotting leaves and diesel exhaust. His heart hammered in a frantic syncopation with the distant throb of a generator as he squeezed through the narrow gap in the fence, trespassing onto the land that had been stolen from his bloodline. Henry reached a wide clearing bathed in an eerie, spectral moonlight and froze before the remains of the fallen. The fresh stumps of centuries-old oaks glowed with a ghostly whiteness, looking like open, weeping sores on the body of the ridge. Henry sank to his knees, his fingers touching the sticky, golden resin that still wept from the wood, a lifeblood that should have pulsed for another 100 years. The official date for the harvest remained days away, yet he counted dozens of slaughtered trunks. He pulled a camera from his pack, the soft, mechanical clicks of the shutter blending with the mournful sigh of the night wind. The flash momentarily ignited the darkness, capturing the chaotic evidence of global logging's secret massacre, documenting every jagged cut and stolen life. A sudden, violent beam of light struck Henry directly in the eyes, searing his vision into a white, featureless blur. He threw an arm up to shield his face, hearing the harsh, metallic shouts of patrolmen echoing through the timber. The heavy thud of security boots crunched through the underbrush, closing the distance. Henry spun on his heel and bolted toward the dense heart of the thicket, where the hemlock branches wove together in a wall of needles. Sharp twigs lashed across his face, leaving stinging welts, but he pushed through the pain. The shouting of the pursuers began to fade behind him, replaced by the ragged sound of his own breathing and the frantic snap of dry wood beneath his boots as he plunged into a lightless, unfamiliar sector of the woods. Henry's boot slipped on a moss-slicked stone, sending him tumbling headlong down the steep, treacherous slope of a hidden ravine. The impacts against roots and rocks knocked the air from his lungs in short, painful gasps. He came to rest at the bottom, the copper taste of blood and the grit of soil filling his mouth. When he finally lifted his head, he found himself encircled by a ring of black totems, carved from a stone that seemed to drink the moonlight. They rose from between the massive, claw-like roots of the oaks like petrified sentinels. The surface of the idols looked oily and alive, absorbing what little light reached the floor of the hollow. An unnatural, biting cold filled the trench, and Henry felt the hair on his neck stand up as a heavy, expectant silence settled over the glade. Henry rose slowly, his eyes locked on the central monolith that towered above the others. Its surface shimmered with a dark, iridescent sheen, pulling at his gaze with a magnetic force that overrode his instinct to flee. His trembling fingers reached out toward the black stone, which was coated in a strange, viscous film. The moment his skin made contact with the slick surface, a jolt of ice-cold energy surged up his arm. The substance on the totem felt warm and rhythmic, as if a massive, subterranean heartbeat just beneath the mineral crust. Henry tried to pull away, but a sudden, inexplicable curiosity anchored him there, forcing him to press his palm flat against the pulsing darkness of the ancient carving. The air around Henry thickened instantly, turning into a heavy, syrupy substance that burned in his lungs. The absolute silence of the ravine exploded inside his skull into a cacophony of thousands of voices. They weren't screams, but a frantic, overlapping whisper in languages that felt older than the mountains themselves. Henry squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his free hand against his ear. But the sounds originated from within his own mind. The walls of the ravine began to shimmer and warp before his eyes, the whispering rising into a deafening roar. Within the noise, he felt the groan of the earth and the ancient, tectonic fury of trees demanding a reckoning for every branch severed by the saw. Henry jerked his shoulder, desperate to break the connection, but his hand remained fused to the black stone as if welded by heat. From the soil beneath his boots, thin, luminous threads erupted like living capillaries, winding tightly around his ankles. He felt these spectral roots pierce through his trousers and skin, grafting themselves directly into his nervous system. A flash of white-hot agony blinded him, and his perception fractured. The trunks of the surrounding oaks appeared to him as giant, pulsing veins filled with thick, black ichor. The world turned inside out in Henry's mind, and he felt the crawl of every worm in the dirt and the shudder of every leaf as if they were his own flesh and bone. Stumbling and gasping, Henry finally hauled himself out of the ravine and onto the shoulder of a logging road. His movements had become erratic, characterized by sharp, mechanical twitches. He looked down at his hands, but his vision blurred, seeing only the faded, gray outlines of the man he used to be. The forest around him no longer felt like a collection of trees. It felt like a single, vast organism that had just finished swallowing him whole. He stood in the middle of the road, the moonlight casting a long, distorted shadow that didn't seem to follow the movements of his body, while the voices in his head began to settle into a single, low-frequency hum. A few days later, Henry stood on a makeshift wooden dais in front of the town hall, his knuckles white as he gripped a folder of evidence. The square of Blackwood Creek was packed with men in grease-stained work jackets, their faces hard and unforgiving. Henry tried to shout over the rising murmur of the crowd, but Mike Donovan, a local farmer whose land bordered the corporate lease, stepped forward and spat a thick stream of tobacco juice onto the pavement. Donovan waved a fat envelope of corporate compensation and bellowed that Henry's interference would starve the town of its last chance at survival. The air filled with the roar of 100 voices, coalescing into a wall of pure, unadulterated hatred. Henry saw the glint of greed in his neighbors' eyes, their faces twisting into a collective mask of rejection. The heavy work boot of Mike Donovan slammed into Henry's chest, throwing him backward onto the gritty asphalt. Henry felt the world tilt as a rain of blows descended upon him. Men he had known since childhood struck him with a rhythmic, clinical brutality, aiming for his ribs and his face. The metallic tang of blood filled his mouth as a hand tangled in his hair, grinding his cheek into the sharp gravel of the square. Above him, a storm of curses broke. They called him a traitor to his own kind, a fanatic who would rather see them rot than see a tree fall. Each strike was accompanied by the sickening sound of tearing fabric and the dull thud of bruising flesh. Henry tried to curl into a ball, but the crowd pressed in, a human tide that cut off the sun and any hope for mercy. The screech of tires announced the arrival of a patrol car, forcing the mob to retreat a few grudging steps. Sheriff Miller stepped out, casually adjusting the heavy utility belt that sagged under the weight of his sidearm. Instead of offering a hand, Miller pressed the cold muzzle of his revolver against Henry's temple, pinning him to the dust. With his other hand, the sheriff reached down and snapped the camera from Henry's broken fingers. The sound of the plastic housing shattering was as final as a gavel. Miller fished out the memory card, clicked a lighter, and watched with cold eyes as the plastic bubbled and melted into a foul-smelling black bead. Henry watched the smoke carry away his only proof of the massacre, while Miller leaned down and whispered a warning. Disappear, or the forest would find a permanent place for his bones. Henry staggered into the hallway of his home, his weight leaning heavily against the doorframe. On the once white wallpaper, intricate patterns of black mold had begun to bloom, looking like a network of dark, pulsing veins. Henry reached out a trembling hand, and the fuzzy dark growth seemed to lean toward his touch, responding to his presence. The mass throbbed, expanding and contracting in a perfect, sickening unison with the feverish beat of his heart. A heavy scent of wet earth and ancient rot filled the rooms, drowning out the familiar smell of pine sol and old wood. Henry watched in a daze as the mold crept over the framed photographs on the wall, swallowing the faces of his parents and grandparents, erasing the Calloway history as if it were being scrubbed from time itself. The whispering in Henry's skull intensified, becoming a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth. Driven by a sudden, violent impulse from deep within his gut, he bolted into the yard under the indifferent light of the stars. His fingers felt like iron talons as he plunged them into the soft earth around the decorative saplings Global Logging had planted as a community gesture. With a guttural snarl, Henry ripped the young trees from the ground, the roots snapping with the sound of breaking bone. Dirt and small stones wedged under his fingernails, but he felt no pain. He worked with a frenzied, inhuman strength, tossing the mangled remains of the corporate greenery into the dark. In his mind, the chorus of the roots rose in a triumphant, dissonant song, urging him to purge the land of these false pretenders. Henry stood before the cracked mirror in his bathroom, the flickering overhead light casting long, jerking shadows. The skin on his forearms had taken on the color of wet slate, its texture turning coarse and ridged like the bark of an old elm. As he squeezed his hand into a fist, the surface of his skin split with a dry, woody crack. Instead of red blood, a thick, iridescent black resin seeped from the fissures, and beneath the opening, he saw the dense, fibrous weave of heartwood instead of muscle. Henry opened his mouth to scream, but his vocal cords produced only the dry, grating sound of branches rubbing together in a storm. He stared at his reflection, watching as his humanity was systematically replaced by the brutal, unyielding anatomy of the woods. A shadow among shadows. Henry moved through the rows of silent machinery at the Global Logging staging area. He stopped before a massive, predatory bulldozer, his fingers weeping dark, sticky pitch. He unscrewed the fuel cap with a mechanical precision, and the black substance from his own open wounds began to flow into the machine's steel gullet. The voice of the roots vibrated in his mind with a hungry anticipation as the resin hit the diesel, initiating a slow, corrosive reaction. Henry felt a strange, detached sense of relief as he fed his own mutating flesh into the belly of the beast. To him, the metal felt like a cold, intrusive corpse, and he was the infection that would finally bring the machine to its knees. The first, weak light of dawn touched the bathroom floor, and Henry collapsed, his body racked by a silent, shuddering agony. The skin on his legs had begun to fuse together, the dark, bark-like growth creeping upward toward his torso. The light felt like a physical weight, a searing heat that made his new, woody flesh smoke and crack. He crawled into the shadows of the hallway, his movements stiff and angular. The transformation was no longer a slow rot. It was an invasion. He could feel the roots of the forest reaching out for him from the floorboards, and the roots within him reaching back, seeking a union that would leave nothing of the man named Henry Calloway behind. Henry pressed his body against the rough bark of a pine, hovering in the deep shadows at the edge of the corporate camp's perimeter. Through the screen of needles, he watched the long trestle tables where global logging employees sat under strings of work lights, surrounded by the debris of a celebration. The sound of their laughter reached Henry's ears as a wet, repulsive gurgle, stripped of all human warmth. His vision stuttered, overlaying the scenes with jagged, crimson pulses. Instead of men in high-visibility vests, he saw bloated, pale parasites feasting on the marrow of the hills. The smell of their grilled meat and cheap beer turned his stomach, smelling to him like the stench of a fresh kill left to rot in the sun. The voice of the roots surged, a tidal wave of ancient, cold command that drowned out his remaining thoughts. It demanded a sacrifice, a payment in red to satisfy the black earth. Henry's hand went to the heavy felling axe at his belt, his fingers, now more wood than flesh, fusing to the handle. He didn't feel the weight of the metal, he felt only the hunger of the edge. The forest around him seemed to lean in, the shadows stretching toward the camp like reaching fingers. He stepped out from the tree line, his movements no longer human, but a series of calculated, predatory lurches. He wasn't a man going to a fight. He was a force of nature being channeled through a broken vessel. He moved through the outer ring of the camp, the darkness swallowing his approach. He found a stack of fuel drums near the generator shed. With a single, powerful swing, he buried the axe head into the thin metal, the scent of gasoline erupting into the night air. He didn't stop. He moved from drum to drum, his strength unnatural, the metal shrieking as it gave way. The voice in his head rose to a fever pitch, a rhythmic chanting that matched the thud of his heart. He pulled a flare from his pocket, his wooden thumb fumbling with the striker. When the phosphorus ignited, the harsh red light revealed his face, a mask of ridged bark and hollow, obsidian eyes. Before he dropped the flame into the spreading pool of fuel, the explosion was a physical blow that threw Henry into the dirt. But he scrambled up, unfeeling. Fire raced across the camp, turning the celebration into a panicked, screaming chaos. In the flickering orange light, Henry saw a figure running toward him. Tom Wilson, his oldest friend, eyes wide with a terror that Henry no longer understood. Tom was shouting, his voice thin and fragile against the roar of the flames, pleading with Henry to stop, to look at what he was doing. Henry raised the axe, the fire reflecting in his dark, unblinking eyes. To him, Tom was no longer a brother. He was just another obstacle, a sapling in the path of a landslide. Henry swung the axe, the heavy head whistling through the air. But at the last microsecond, a flicker of something, a memory of a shared beer, a hunt in the high ridges, made his wooden wrist jerk. The blade buried itself into a nearby support beam with a bone-shattering jar. Tom fell back, gasping, staring at the monster that had once been his friend. The voice of the roots shrieked in fury at the hesitation, a psychic lash that sent Henry to his knees. Around them, the camp was a hellscape of melting plastic and screaming metal. Henry looked at his hands, seeing the black resin bubbling from his joints in the heat. And for a fleeting second, the horror of his own transformation eclipsed the rage of the forest. The world dissolved into a blur of smoke and the rough handling of men who didn't care if they broke his brittle limbs. He woke on the freezing concrete of a holding cell, the chill of the floor seeping through his clothes like 1,000 needles. The air was a stagnant mix of bleach and old sweat. From somewhere far beyond the thick masonry, the high-pitched mechanical shriek of chainsaws reached him, a sound that vibrated in his very marrow. Each whine of the saws felt like a serrated blade drawing across his own nerves. He lay in the dark, his teeth grinding together until they felt like they would shatter, listening to the rhythmic execution of the woods he had failed to save. Henry's nails, thick and dark like talons, scraped against the rough plaster of the cell wall, leaving deep, white gouges. Fragments of the failed raid flickered in his mind. The blinding sweep of floodlights, the crushing weight of a guard's boot on his neck, and the biting cold of the shackles. He inhaled the sour, cramped air, the taste of defeat as heavy as ash on his tongue. A sudden tremor shook his frame as he realized the depth of his impotence. He hadn't stopped the machines. He had only accelerated the end. Now he was a prisoner of stone while the iron jaws of the harvesters outside systematically erased the only world he had ever known. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Sheriff Miller's boots echoed down the corridor, stopping outside the bars. Miller leaned against the steel, a mocking grin splitting his face as he rattled a baton against the cage. He tossed a rolled-up newspaper through the gap, the paper splashing into a small puddle of condensation on the floor. On the front page, beneath a headline celebrating "Progress for Blackwood," a grainy photograph showed the first of the great oaks toppling into the dust. Miller spat on the floor and made a comment about clearing out the old rot. Henry stared at the image, his pupils dilating as he absorbed the sight of the fallen titan, its branches broken and splayed like the limbs of a murdered king. Henry pressed his palms hard against his ears, trying to shut out the world. But the silence refused to come. Within the architecture of his bones, a low subterranean hum began to pulse, perfectly timed with the distant impact of trees hitting the forest floor. Each time a trunk struck the earth, a short, sharp jolt of energy raced through Henry's joints. His skeleton had become a tuning fork for the forest's agony. Sweat poured down his ridged, bark-like brow as he curled into a tight ball on the narrow cot, trying to muffle the vibrations. He felt every severed root and every crushed nest as a physical void opening up inside his own mind. The voice of the roots, once a roaring tide of fury, suddenly went cold and silent. The overlapping whispers in his head were replaced by a singular, indifferent hiss, like wind through dead leaves. The voices no longer demanded action. They spoke with a detached, chilling finality. He heard the truth in the silence. He was nothing more than a discarded tool, a temporary vessel for a darkness that was already seeking a new host. A profound, hollow cold filled Henry's chest as he realized the forest didn't care about his sacrifice. The voice told him his human will was a nuisance. And now that the seed of the black stone was planted, he was merely a hollowed-out husk, an empty shell left to rot in a cage. Henry lifted his hands to his face in the sickly yellow light of the cell. The black patches of bark had hardened, losing all sensation and fusing into a solid, unyielding plate. When he tried to move his fingers, a dry, wooden snapping sound echoed in the small space. His forearms were now encased in a scaly, armored growth, with sharp, dead twigs protruding like thorns from his elbows. The pain was gone, replaced by a terrifying, total numbness. He ran a hand down his thigh and felt only the friction of wood against wood. His limbs no longer belonged to the world of blood and muscle. They were becoming part of a slow, vegetable decay, turning him into a living statue of the very trees being slaughtered outside. A corporate attorney in a sharp, slate-gray suit sat across from Henry in the interrogation room, fastidiously adjusting his glasses. He laid out a thick stack of legal documents, his voice a dry, rhythmic rustle. He informed Henry that the attack on the camp had provided the necessary legal grounds to declare the entire relic zone a high-risk area. The forest's protected status had been stripped away in an emergency session, and a massive industrial plant would now be fast-tracked on the site. Henry listened as the man explained how his terrorist act had been the final nail in the forest's coffin. Every word was a jagged spike driven into Henry's heart. His rage had been the very weapon global logging needed to finish the job. Henry staggered to the narrow, barred window of his cell, his wooden fingers clicking against the iron. On the horizon, where the lush, emerald canopy of Blackwood Creek had once touched the sky. Thick columns of gray dust and oily smoke now billowed upward. He could see the orange flickers of brush fires. The corporate crews were burning the remains of the ancient grove. The scent of charred pine and ancient loam drifted through the bars, smelling to Henry like the scent of his own burning flesh. The horizon was flattening, the skyline of his ancestors being erased in a blur of smoke and ash. And Henry opened his mouth to scream. But only a hollow, dry wheeze emerged. From the hairline cracks in the concrete floor, a thick, iridescent black liquid began to seep upward. It pooled in the depressions of the floor, moving with a sluggish, deliberate intent toward Henry's boots. The substance smelled of wet earth and a deep, primordial rot, the same scent that had clung to the black totems in the ravine. Henry watched as the pool grew, reflecting the flickering fluorescent light like a dark, unblinking eye. The liquid seemed to pulse in time with his own failing heartbeat. He understood then that these were the tears of the mountain, the lifeblood of the slaughtered woods, finding its way to the last of its kin. The darkness filled the room, turning the cell into a tomb of liquid shadow. Henry sank to his knees, allowing his heavy, wooden hands to submerge in the black mire. The cold of the liquid soaked through the bark of his skin, drawn into the fibrous depths of his mutating body. He closed his eyes, letting the last flickers of his human identity, his anger, his grief, his failed hopes, dissolve into the bitter, black sludge. The boundaries between his mind and the dying forest vanished completely. He felt himself in every splintered trunk and every scorched acre of the ridge. He stopped fighting the transformation, inviting the darkness to fill the hollowed-out spaces of his soul, becoming a silent witness to the total erasure of his world. When the guard made his morning rounds, he stopped at Henry's cell and recoiled, the heavy iron keys slipping from his numb fingers. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a grotesque, motionless shape in the corner. Where a man had been sitting the night before, there was now only a jagged, blackened pillar of wood and resin. The figure of Henry Calloway had become a gnarled, fire-scarred stump, his clothes fused into the thick, cracked bark of his torso. From the place where his face should have been, dry, leafless branches reached upward toward the ceiling. The cell was filled with the heavy, cloying scent of a stagnant swamp and cold ash. The guard crossed himself and slammed the heavy steel shutter, leaving the last of the Calloways to rot in the silence of his own dead kingdom.